Columbus through the Revolution. In Facing East from Indian Country, author Daniel Richter tells the story of the original Americans through the lives of Pocahontas, Blessed Catherine de Caqueta, and Metacom. This program from the Library Company of Philadelphia runs 55 minutes.
We're very pleased to be presenting Daniel K. Richter as our speaker this evening. Dan is fairly new to Philadelphia, having arrived just a little over 2 years ago from Dickinson College to become a professor of history at Penn and the director of the McNeill Center for Early American Studies. Dan's going to be speaking tonight about the second book that he's written that deals with Native Americans in the colonial and early national period of our history. His first book, which was called The Ordeal of the Longhouse, The Peoples of the Iroquois League in the Era of European Colonization, came out in 1992 and was based on Dan's Columbia University doctoral dissertation. And it won both the Ray Allen Billington Prize and the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians. His new book that we're going to be hearing about this evening, Facing East from Indian Country, A Native History of Early America, practically turns our view of the nation's early history on its head. In it, Dan explores more than 300 years of Indian-white relations east of the Mississippi, from the turn of the 16th century through the subjugation of the native peoples during the Jacksonian era. And he does this from the point of view of the Indians themselves. His perspective is always facing east, contemplating how Indians responded to the white influence and presence in their lands. And it is not a simple story of the ineluctable westward expansion of whites and the disappearance of Indians and their displacement. Rather, it's a story of mutual interaction and interchange as both Indians and whites dealt with the powerful forces that the arrival of the whites unleashed. His concern is particularly with the economic and environmental and biological dimensions of that interchange, and the ways in which the Indians over time adapted to the white presence and sought to maintain their integrity both as individual tribes and as a greater people. The year 1763 looms large in this story when the British virtually eliminated the French from the continent and also thereby eliminated the ability of the Indians to play balance of power politics and playing off one empire against the other. And the aftermath of the American Revolution was another watershed, for it removed the British themselves from the equation and gave the new nation a virtual carte blanche to drive the Indians from its midst. This process reached its sanguinary culmination in the removals of the Jacksonian era. Dan does a masterful job of viewing this long and tortured history through an Indian prism, and he allows us to see how this tragedy played out to those who were looking east. So I'm very pleased to present Daniel Richter this evening.
Thanks, John, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks for everyone for being here tonight. It's I don't quite know what to make of such a big crowd on this occasion. And I want to thank particularly John and Jim Green on behalf of the Library Company, and David Mocha Hansen and Shan Holt, who's here somewhere, on behalf of HSP for organizing this event. Library Company and HSP are just two of the greatest places in the world, two of my favorite places to be, and I can't think of any place I'd rather be tonight talking about this book. As some of you, many of you know, the McNeill Center for Early American Studies has a sort of traveling seminar that moves all over the area, and we frequently meet here at the Library Company, although usually in the other room over here where you had your refreshments, and the speaker there usually faces east. So it's a little disorienting to be here facing south, but I'll try to deal with that anyway. I'm not quite sure what to do in an event like this. A summary of the book seems a little redundant for those who've already read it, perhaps counterproductive for those who haven't, and besides, I think John did a better job than I could have of summing up the book in his introduction. And furthermore, I think Facing East, at least from my perspective, probably this close to it, is a little hard to summarize in a few words, and so I don't think I'm going to try to do that tonight. A reading seems a bit literary and a bit heavy. I don't think I'm going to try anything dramatic, and I don't even have a copy of the book with me, so you're spared that. I'm not much one for true confessions of stories of my own life and how I came to be here, so I'm not going to do that either, although I do assure you that I don't have any skeletons I know about in my closet. I've never claimed to have fought in Vietnam. think all the words in the book that aren't my own are in quotation marks, so I hope that there's no confessions in order. When I asked John and David what I should do, they weren't much help either. They talked a lot about time, and I think they encouraged me to keep this down to 3 or 4 hours, so I'll try to do my best. But the one hint they did give was that maybe I could say a few things about how I came to write the book and where it sort of fits in the broader scheme of things. So I think I'll start with that, and along the way try to explain a little bit about what I mean by facing east and some of the things I hope that I've been able to do in this book. The origins of this book are not at all straightforward, and one of the things I've actually been trying to figure out over the last couple of days is how I did come to write this book. And I think the first thing that suddenly occurred to me, and maybe this is a little bit self-revelatory, I never seem to be able to write the books I set out to write. And I think it started when I went to graduate school to study Puritans and wound up doing this whole other thing. The book that became The Ordeal of the Longhouse started out to be a study of the New York frontier during the American Revolution. And I was going to sort of do this complicated multi-ethnic analysis of why different groups chose the path they did during the Revolution. I figured the Indian stuff had already been done, and I'd just read a few books and kind of plug that in. And I discovered it hadn't been done, and I kind of got focused on particularly the Six Nations Iroquois, and then I kept moving backwards in time. And the book that ultimately I wrote started literally with creation and never got past 1730, so I never got to the American Revolution. Well, that's a bit of a background, and after that book came out, I entered a phase of not quite knowing what to do next, stumbled into a couple of things, particularly by way of some things friends and colleagues had asked me to do. Among them was a historiographical essay on Native Americans in Pennsylvania, and I wrote that and came to the conclusion that there was a huge historiographical black hole, and that historiographical black hole was the years after the American Revolution. An awful lot of very important stuff seemed to be going on, and almost no one had written about it. So I set off to do a project about Pennsylvanians and Native Americans after the American Revolution. And I had a year's leave in the early 90s, spent much of that year in Philadelphia, spent much of the time I was on that leave in the wonderful old manuscript reading room next door at the HSP. Many of you remember what a great place that was to work. Collected a huge number of notes, did a lot of work on that project, and I really thought I was going to write about that. And then the next thing I knew, other things happened. And I got this invitation to write a sort of classroom supplementary reading book, about Native Americans in the colonial period. I thought, that'll be easy. I can knock that off in, a year or two. I can kind of write this quick 200-pager and get it out of the way and do that, and then get back and really figure out what I wanted to do about the other project. So I signed a contract to do what was supposed to be a pretty straightforward narrative history of Native Americans in colonial times, depending on defining what colonial meant was a sort of open-ended issue there. So I was supposed to be doing that. The next thing I knew, I'd been invited to a sort of celebration for my graduate school advisor, Alden Vaughn, who was retiring in the early 1990s, and instead of a sort of standard operation of having people give serious scholarly papers and produce a Festschrift of essays that no one would ever read and publishers would never publish, someone got the bright idea that we should have a sort of workshop for high school teachers, and that all of us who were students of Alden Vaughn should come in and talk about our particular specialties and how they might inform high school teachers' curricula as they taught American history. One of the neat things about Alden was that he would let you do anything, which of course is why I was able to change my topic in midstream and awesome. So we had this wonderfully diverse group of people who had studying all sorts of different aspects of early American history, and we came and had a really nice couple of days in Worcester, Massachusetts, talking to these high school teachers and sort of trying to convince them that what we were doing was a neat way to look at early American history. And so in doing that, I found myself saying, well, how do you teach early American history? And I came up with this phrase that I didn't quite know what the phrase meant, but I said you should face east, and you should not sort of maybe think about ways of having your students not sort of stand on the deck of the Mayflower or the Susan Constant or something and follow people as they come from Europe to the wilderness of America, or perhaps come to Europe to Native America, fall on their knees and kill some people and then go about the real story. But rather, that's what I call a westward-facing history. The storyline runs from Europe to North America. The real characters are the Europeans, and it's a story that, in a sense, makes North American history an adjunct to European history, and inevitably, I think, makes Native Americans either irrelevant or simply victims of a juggernaut that is rolling westward. Okay, so I said, let's try facing east. Let's try to see if we can find ways to get students to think about American history that is rooted in this continent here, that tries to develop storylines that don't face west from Europe, but face east from North America. And I said, try to imagine, your students as reporters, and you're going to sort of assign them to the deadbeat. I think I actually used that phrase. And sort of send them into the past to try to imagine how American history might look if you stood in North America in Indian country and looked over the shoulder of an Algonquian woman hoeing her cornfield instead of standing on the deck of the Mayflower and looking west. And that sounded very nifty at the time. And I tried to explain in particular that I meant something significant by saying standing over the shoulder of the Algonquian woman hoeing her cornfield, because I didn't think it was possible for us to get inside that woman's head and see things through her eyes. And I still think that as a sort of turn of the 21st century middle-aged white guy, there's no way that I could get inside the heads of Native Americans 300 years ago. But rather, the idea is to stand in Indian country, try to develop ways of thinking about Native American history in general that imagine the story being told from this place and from a place that starts as Indian country, and to put Indians as much as possible at center stage in the stories. So that's what I tried to convince those high school teachers of. They seemed to appreciate it, and then went back, presumably, to teaching things the way they always did, because it was totally unoperationalizable. They couldn't really quite imagine how this was supposed to work. I went home and tried to sit down to write this boring, straightforward 200-page book about Native American history, and just kept hitting a blank wall. I spent, as several of my summers have been over the years, staring at a computer screen and going off to do woodworking projects at home, and coming back to stare at the computer screen some more. I tried to write the chapter that was supposed to start somewhere at the Bering Straits and get us to 1492 in one chapter, and then let the real story start, and nothing was coming out. And all the time I kept thinking, well, I got to face east, and I kept thinking about that Algonquian woman hoeing her cornfield, who just kept living in my head somewhere. And so the next thing I knew, I was writing a first draft of what became the chapter 1 of Facing East, which really was initially this effort to try to be a reporter standing in Indian country in the 16th century. And so what I did in there was try to look at the various texts, particularly focusing on the De Soto expedition and Cartier's visits to the St. Lawrence Valley, and try to imagine what that might have looked like if we were standing there watching it, and trying to figure out how you could read those documents to make that happen. I had a lot of fun with it, and it was about the time that John Demos's book, The Unredeemed Captive, came out, where he suddenly made it possible to make stuff up. As a legitimate, I mean that in a respectful way, as a way of trying to recapture something about the past. And so I felt liberated to make some stuff up here, not footnoting everything and making sure that it was all somehow rooted in the documents, but really sort of imagining being there and what it might have looked like if we could be there. And I also discovered that perhaps this was an interesting way to think about how Native Americans discovered Europe, because of course their experience was really largely about imagining where these people and things came from. And so I sort of developed what I thought was kind of a fun exercise in Facing East. And I said, this is what it's all about. And I gave the paper a couple of places, one of them back to Philadelphia. I keep getting dragged back to Philadelphia. This is another theme. Don't set out what I want to do and do what I set out to do when I come back to Philadelphia. But I came to Philadelphia and gave this paper at one of Michael Zuckerman's wonderful little evening soirees that many of you know about. And people seem to appreciate it. I'm like, okay, I'm really onto something here. Right? So then I sent this draft off to my good friend Jim Merrill. And if you don't know Jim Merrill, he is a wonderful historian of early America. Has written a couple of just stunning books about Native American history. And he said, this is pretty neat, but what are you going to do next? Are you going to have your readers just running around backwards all over the continent facing east, Okay, we've run around for a while in the 16th century. Now we're going to run around facing backwards and from here, there, and everywhere. And I thought, yeah, Jim, you're right. This is just not going to be able to sustain this for an entire book. So I went into another slough of despond, went off, built some more bookcases, and did some more woodworking at home, and began to rethink, well, you know, if I do this, maybe the real point is trying to explore different ways of facing east and thinking about how this metaphor might work itself out in ways that are not quite so straightforward as imagining yourself on the scene, but different ways of trying to make stories work that recapture something of a history of Native America. So then I thought, well, okay, let's try to think about different chapters, each of which does this. And, you know, how can you face East in different ways? Along about that time, I wrote to my editor for the book I had a contract for and said, I think what I'm writing is probably not what you're looking for. And he said, yeah, it's not what we're looking for. So we broke the contract, and I thought, okay, now this is really neat. I can write the book I want to write. I don't have to cover stuff anymore. You know, I can leave things out. So I started playing with this, and I thought, well, okay, how can we face East? And one way we can do this is, as John said, to not just have this kind of imagination as our device, but to look at radically different ways of putting stories together. And so one of the ways I tried to do that was in what became the second chapter of the book, which is to look at material forces. And in particular, I hope the contrast is kind of interesting as you go from this kind of imagined being there kind of chapter into one that plunges you right into microbes and material goods and ecological change, and sort of looking at the continent itself and how it's changing as a way of facing East became the next thing I did. And then I said, well, you know, it's all about telling stories, and so let's tell some stories. And so I took 3 familiar life stories, or at least semi-familiar life stories, or at least stories that were familiar to some people. Those stories were the stories of Pocahontas, Gatari Tekakwitha, who will probably be the first Native American saint, and King Philip. And said, well, let's just try to turn these stories upside down and say, what might they really be if we could try to tell them as Indian history as opposed to European history. And I hoped that as I was trying to write that, I wasn't saying this is the straight poop on these people. There are various ways to look at it, but let's just try to see what fragmentary information we have might help us see them as emblematic of some larger forces that were going on in the 17th century in North America. So I finally thought I was on a roll. The next chapter was going to be one that really got back to, I think, the original idea, which was writing something for undergraduates. How do you read documents was going to be the theme of the next one. And so I looked at particularly a set of texts that were extremely problematic, words that were written down by Europeans, through which presumably some glimmering of a native voice came through. If voices can glimmer, some echo of a native voice came through. So I kind of tried to sort of walk through an effort to read those things. And then I hit another brick wall because I'd run out of ways to face East. I thought, okay, imagine material forces, life stories, how do you read documents? And then the other, of course, thing that was happening was as I began to move forward through time, and I did figure out how I could make these things kind of work chronologically, that I was getting into a period when we knew a whole lot more about actual stuff, and that the real problem was less trying to bridge the gaps in the documents and figure out how we could reconstruct something of Native experiences, and more how, particularly as you get into the 18th century, which is another historiographical black hole, despite the fact that there are millions of books written on the 18th century. In general, American historians have not known how to deal with the 18th century. Now, quite apart from Native American history. You know, people get off those ships and they do all sorts of neat things in the 17th century. They hang some witches, they do their Puritan thing, Puritanism declines, and then you have this sort of boring period when, I don't know, people are living in Williamsburg. And And then, of course, there was the problem of trying to, well, do I or do I not try to deal with the American Revolution and try to make something of Native American experiences there. So I struggle with that, but I think ultimately what I tried to do was write something that looks a little more like a straightforward narrative, and I do sort of move through the 18th century and in 2 chapters, and then have a long chapter on the long American Revolution, starting in 1763 and ending in about 1830. But really trying to say that those are also ways of facing east, trying to kind of invert narratives or look at ways of telling stories that might help us keep Native Americans center stage, and maybe even tell us something that we didn't think we knew, or perhaps had only glimpsed about early American history. So what I did for the 18th century chapter, to try to get us out of the living in Williamsburg mode, was to try to apply a paradigm that historians have been using a lot for the 18th century in recent years, and that is sort of think about the Atlantic world and the imperial system and how Native Americans might have fit into that. And one of the things I hope that chapter tries to do is recapturing what looks like a period when nothing much is happening, a way of seeing Native Americans as real actors and adapting to an imperial system and carving out for themselves in the imperial world a sort of new Native North America. So I did that, and then the Revolution chapter, as John suggested, focuses particularly on 1763, but tries to sort of see the year 1763, I think, as a kind of lens through which to watch everything that would happen later. In particular, I focus in that chapter on 2 really cataclysmic events of that year. What's usually referred to as Pontiac's Rebellion. That's a shorthand term for a very complicated event. And another complicated phrase is the Paxton Boys affair. And kind of looking at both of those as articulations of a kind of new and stark vision, one on the Native American side and one on the Euro-American side, of a continent in which Europeans and Indians no longer could imagine living together. And I try to look at these 2 ideologies, which by no means are shared by everybody on either side of what suddenly became in 1763 a frontier, a line instead of a messy situation of a lot of people. And try to sort of see if we can capture something about how those ideas first articulated in 1763 worked themselves out over the next few years, and help us understand something about the nature of the United States that replaced, in many respects, Indian country in that period. So that's what I thought I did, or what I hope I thought I did. And this book has evolved in a way that I hadn't quite anticipated. And in particular, I've always thought that, or hoped that the book would be just as much about how to write this kind of history as it was about the history itself. In fact, I'm not even sure it is about that history. It's more about trying to get us to think about things in ways that try to follow up on that metaphor of a native history that's rooted in this continent, but one that doesn't pretend, really, very often at least, doesn't pretend to actually see things through native eyes or to recapture in any kind of definitive way Native American experiences, but does try to keep Native Americans center stage, and to see a story that is rooted in this continent and its long history before Europeans arrived. But also, just as much as that, to try to give us ways of thinking about a real history for Native Americans in that long period. And what I mean by a real history for Native Americans is finding a way to think about periodization, trying to think about change, trying to think about Native Americans as human beings who change and adapt and live in time, and don't inhabit some kind of static, timeless paradise that was disrupted by Europeans, and then spend the rest of their time trying to recapture that, but rather change, adapt, struggle, live in history, and are people who move through time in ways that we can often only glimpse. But I hope some of the ways that I've tried to lay this out in the book will be useful in helping us to move that along. So that's what I hope I did. I could continue to talk about this, but I won't, except to say that I did close the book with an epilogue that looks at very closely at the work of an early 19th century fascinating figure, William Apis, who often signed his name William Apis a Pequot, a Native American author in the 1830s, whose significance was, I think, first brought to our attention by Barry O'Connell, a student of American literature, who wrote a variety of works. He was a Methodist preacher. He was a political activist. He was an author and memoirist, and he was, in many respects, a pretty good historian, too. And so I look in particular at a speech he gave in the 1830s called A Eulogy on King Philip, which looks back at some of the things that are discussed earlier in the book, and also, I think, epitomize in some ways what I mean by facing east. William Apis himself trying to recapture something of a Native American past and trying to tell stories that self-consciously contradicted many of the myths and the standard histories of his own day. So I said I wasn't going to summarize the book, but that's what I wound up doing. I hope I've said something that's at least interesting, if not provocative, and would welcome questions and comments and anything else you might have. I think we have a microphone that is traveling around the room.
There's a traveling mic, so please hold your questions till this fellow gets in your neighborhood.
This is a pretty formidable.
It looks more like a feather duster to me, actually.
To what extent is the treaty-making process between the Native Americans and the colonists a means of gaining entry to the mentality and perspective of the Native Americans?
Well, one of the things I do in the book is actually look fairly closely at some of the minutes of treaty negotiations, right? And in particular, try to follow up on what they tell us about what Native Americans thought was happening at those events, which is not necessarily what Europeans thought was happening and not necessarily perhaps what we even mean by treaty. Much of that has to do with, I suppose, a view that a treaty is not so much about a deal or a particular set of arrangements or a particular set of agreements. And in fact, from a Native perspective, maybe signing a document would be one of the least significant parts, or at least one of only many parts in the process. That really treaties are about the process of having a treaty. It's about affirming in a very public and participatory way an ongoing relationship between two peoples. And it has to do with ceremonial ritual. It has to do with making sure that lots of people are present. One of the things that, of course, always dismays European governors is the expense and the time and the delays that are involved with all these people descending on Albany or Williamsburg or Philadelphia or whatever. It's important that they're all there. You can't have sort of deals made in smoke-filled longhouses. You've got to, the whole point is the participatory act of enacting the relationship, telling the stories of the relationship, often in very formalized ways, having a kind of metaphor that explains what each side is supposed to be doing for each other, explaining the benefits of the relationship to each other. The language that was often used to describe this was brightening the chain of covenant, right? And chains get rusty. They have to be brightened. You've got to have treaties over and over again. It's not a one-time deal. And all of this is deeply reflective of, I think, not just Native American worldviews, but Native American politics and the way that the political systems of Native Americans worked. Another thing that it tells us, particularly as we look in the 18th century, is it helps us understand something about how the many diverse native cultures of Eastern North America were actually becoming something we can call Indian. By sharing these political rituals, by sharing the participation of treaty making, by sharing in interesting ways through European powers a set of common experiences and common rituals and procedures. That is an interesting insight into, again, thinking about change over time and how people come to have a sense of themselves as being Native Americans as well as being Cherokees or Susquehannocks. Yeah. Yes, sir. I think we'll make our way to the back of the room.
Would Native Americans have fared better if the British had won the American Revolution? And have they fared better in Canada than in the United States?
Short answer is no. They would have fared differently, I think. Actually, Greg Dowd, who's another great contemporary historian of these issues, and I have been sort of fighting about this issue. And he seems to be on a crusade to prove that things would have been even worse had the British stayed in control. What is interesting, though, is that I think in 1763, as the British were trying to figure out what to do with this enormous new empire they had, and trying to figure out what to do with the continent that suddenly, in theory at least, belonged to them, and from which the French had been expelled and the Spanish were a much smaller player than they had been before, was to imagine ways of really sort of incorporating Native Americans into that empire in a way that would have made them subjects, would have made them inferior people, and would not necessarily have been pleasant, but would, I think, significantly have envisioned Native Americans as part of the empire. Right? And one of the ideas I put forward in the book, which I keep waiting for someone to say is terribly wrong, is that this was one of the things that deeply bothered many British Americans of European ancestry. The idea that the British government could actually be imagining Native Americans having rights and having to be protected by the government and being part of the future of the continent in ways that, I'm not saying that somebody sitting in Whitehall really had thought this through, but they really are sort of acting in ways that actually are much more traditionally imperialistic. I mean, what's the point of having an empire if you don't conquer people and incorporate them, right? And it's a very, very different vision, I think, that from 1763 on, many Euro-Americans are developing of a continent that is entirely, in which the native population is entirely replaced by Europeans. And Indians have no place in that continent. In fact, in some of the more bizarre fantasies of people in the early 19th century, white people become the new Indians, right? They become the Americans. They join fraternal organizations that have pseudo-Indian rituals. They even have clubs with names like the Improved Order of Red Men, that literally displace the native population and see no space in that continent for them. So I would argue that had the British remained in control, of course that's a big if, the experience would have been vastly different, not necessarily better, but perhaps something a little more resembling India than the United States. Yes, in the back.
I'm kind of glad that you made that observation, because it kind of falls in line with what I've been thinking, listening to you. The concept that the British could have been, might have been, could, whatever, a better, worse, probably worse. How much worse could it possibly have been than the development of, the concept of westward expansion and manifest destiny? I mean, wiping out the redskin population, the only good Indian is a dead Indian mentality. I don't think the British could ever have created a Commonwealth in which they said the only good Indian, and we're talking New Delhi Indian, is a dead Indian. I mean, maybe after that rebellion with the Greece and all that madness. So what was that? The 1837 or whatever. I don't know. But I see here you talk about 1763 being what you call the the seminal year, the formative year of 1763. And in Pontiac's dream of the Delaware prophet, he says, "This land where ye dwell I have made for you, and not for others. Whence come it that ye permit the whites upon your lands? Can you not live without them?" And then further down, it says, "But if you are not evil as ye are, you could surely do without them. You could live as you did before knowing them. And this is a concept that when I was a kid, I always thought, well, why did the Indians embrace and allow, the European presence and subsequent, dominance. And it kind of makes me wonder that listening to you, it all becomes very clear listening to you, which I don't know if that's fortunate or unfortunate for me. But what it says too is that there was some practical, that there was some almost divine dispensation wherein America is created because of the Native American response to the European, first British, then American presence. I don't know if there's a question in all this, but maybe what it says is that I've come to see it better having listened to you and just casually leafed through your book, that the same way that there was a book written about the Incan and Mayan, the South American Indian response to the Spanish conquistadors. For some reason or other, it all becomes much clearer listening to you that what the American experience vis-a-vis Native Americans post-revolution and into the the period of westward expansion, that mindset, there's a mindset there that sometimes it's often difficult to grasp, and I think that in your looking at the Native American response, one sees better the European/American side of that equation. And I just want to say thank you for that.
Thank you. Yes.
I wanted to hear a little bit. One of the things that I found the most provocative about the book is the way that you sort of posit history as a creative and imaginative endeavor. I mean, it's very easy in sort of the popular public opinion of the way history is done to sort of pigeonhole us as social scientists searching for truth and compiling lists of dates and names. And as many practicing historians know, that's not what we spend our time doing. But this idea of positing a creative and an imaginative way of getting not inside the minds of people, obviously, as you caution, but of thinking about the world in different ways that are revealing in ways that you don't get in just approaching head-on a document that's handed to you in an archive. And I'd just like to hear more about what you think about the process and the possibilities for thinking about history that way.
Well, I think this goes back to my initial sort of teaching aim for the book, that I really do hope that it's all about doing history. It's been one of the things that's been very interesting. I had real trouble selling this manuscript to anyone, particularly early on when it was really all focused on method. And I kept getting these nice rejection letters. Just very interesting, but I think we don't really want a book about doing history. We want a book that is the history, And so if you would really write us something that does what you say people ought to do, then that would be fine. But we just sort of want to know what the real story is. And because I kept sort of thinking, well, and that's not the point, The point is to think about how the stories are put together and what we can learn from that. This is not going to I shouldn't be doing this. In fact, I decided not to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. One of the early reviews was in the Los Angeles Times a month or so ago by a person I don't know, and I don't know whether any of you know him either. And in fact, I've repressed his name. I'm looking for the quote, which I have here in my Anthony Day, who I guess writes a lot of reviews for the Los Angeles Times. And his review focuses on my use of the word narrative all the time. He always puts it in quotes, thinking about stories of the past. And then he concludes, for all Richter's goodwill towards the Indians and his earnest effort to imagine a different narrative, it is hard to conceive of a history much different from that which occurred. Given the energy, skills, and number of the invaders, the Indians never had a chance. And Well, I say, well, okay, that may be the big picture, but I don't think that's what my book is about. It's really about trying to discover something about how people live through this experience and how, in fact, while maybe in the long run we might conclude they didn't have a chance, 300 years is a long time not to have a chance, I think, among other things. So that really, sort of thinking about it, of course the story didn't turn out any differently. This is like the question about the British Empire. It reminds me actually of Saturday Night Live used to have these routines of historians sitting around doing what if, and I think there was one about what if Eleanor Roosevelt could fly. And they did this whole thing about how World War II turned out different. Of course it didn't turn out differently than it did, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn something from trying to understand something about the experiences of people that otherwise might just appear to be mere victims of the process. So.
I've got a kind of double-layered question, and one is there any oral Indian tradition about the Revolutionary period in the Northeast? And the other one is that in literature, which is my field, there are plenty of African Americans and Caribbeans who theatize or who produce literature and who are extensively revising the way it's both thought of and written. And I was wondering if there was anything analogous going on in history in relation to Amerindian groups in the United States.
Certainly, yeah, those are two big questions, not only multi-layered, but big ones. Yes, there are oral traditions about the Revolution, and I guess two that are, one hears quite a bit about today are, one is the story of how Native Americans brought food to George Washington at Valley Forge, which may or may not be accurate, but I think it's an effort to say something about the relationship. Also, of course, the repeated story that we hear that somehow or other the U.S. Constitution was based on the Iroquois League of the Haudenosaunee. All of which are, I think, real efforts to interesting efforts in some ways to face east, to kind of make Native American experiences central to the American experience. There are also stories that are not well documented, to say the least, from a European social science standpoint. And perhaps, like many oral stories, tell us much more about people's place in history as they perceive it than the stuff out there. And that makes it just as interesting and just as important in some ways. As for your second question about how Native understandings have or have not reshaped scholarly understandings, have I tracked the second question?
There are African Americans and Caribbeans who are, and maybe more so in the Caribbean, where they're really theorizing about literature and about the production of literature. So they're creating a whole new just a whole new theory, and different types of work are being done. I mean, it's true of African Americans as well. And I was wondering if there's anything analogous in relation to history and Amerindians. Is there any of that kind of developed, maybe philosophical or theoretical critique of
yes,
of a Western
much
European
of it
discipline?
focused very clearly on a critique of Western social science understandings and an attempt to inform our understandings of history in general. I think with what are described as Native Americans' understandings of time, and much of the literature, although also focuses on a contrast, or sometimes, I think, largely overdrawn, between what is described as a Native American time that is circular and, in a sense, not linear, and not really history as Westerners understand it. That very frequently, I think, gets all wrapped up in a lot of contemporary issues about identity, and in ways that it's hard to figure out how to operationalize this as a historical phenomenon. It is also interesting that in terms of oral traditions, the at least the past of 200 years ago, is, with the exception of a couple of the things I just mentioned, is remarkably unremembered, at least in terms of events in Native traditions, which tells us also something, I think, about the function of those Native traditions, which tend to be about origins, tend to be about identity, tend to be about who people are, and often are indeed not particularly focused on the kinds of questions that Western academic historian types are interested in. Yes.
I wonder if you could say a few words about the Indian mind, since you were trying to get in it and interpret. In my discussion with modern Indians, people who have Indian blood in them, I find that I couldn't get to first base trying to discuss things with them to get a logical conclusion. They didn't think like I did. It was just, and every time I pinned them down, they slipped off and went somewhere else, and just very mercurial. You must have got some view of the Indian mind.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that I'm really hesitant to say there's anything like the Indian mind.
I got the impression there is an Indian mind.
I think there is, I think it might be accurate to say that keep having to remind myself it's the 21st century, that there may be something today that does resemble a Native American way of talking about the world. Okay, but it's also a product of history and a product of dialogue with Westerners, and often is quite self-consciously designed to put forward a point of view that is non-Western. Right. In terms of understanding Native American minds 4 centuries ago, it's a very tough thing. We have very few hints of the way people really express their world. Much of what we do have to go on involves records by people like missionaries and diplomats, in situations where Native Americans had every reason often not to speak their minds plainly. Many of the people I write about spoke languages which are no longer spoken. Related languages still exist, but we don't have access to those minds in the way that we do for European Americans, although I also think we often delude ourselves how much we can get inside the heads of European Americans 300 years ago as well. That's probably why I stopped studying Puritans, because we thought we knew what the Puritan mind was too. But yes. Sure.
I just wondered if you thought at all about how useful these histories and perspectives and narratives would be to contemporary Native Americans in schools or in defining an ongoing relationship with American life?
Mm-hmm. I've thought about that a lot, and I think I keep coming back to the idea that it's not for me to tell Native Americans what's useful to them. I hope that I'm saying something that will be useful, but I will be satisfied if I get Euro-American types and African-American types to see something in this.
We tend to think a lot about Native Americans and Europeans as two separate categories, but in a lot of contexts, those boundaries could be pretty fluid. I'm wondering, among the groups that you studied, was the option for individuals to pass or for groups to be assimilated there, and did any groups choose to go that route, or did individuals choose to go that route?
Well, I suppose it's a couple of things there. One is I would really want to get back to my idea of Native Americans in history and stressing change, because I think in many respects it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to talk about either Native Americans or Euro-Americans before sometime in the 18th century. I probably made it too simple by saying it's July 1st, 1763 when that happens, but there's a kind of messiness to the cultural and social map before that period that makes generalizations either about Euro-Americans or Native Americans not very useful. People lived on a continent that was controlled by lots of different powers, some of them native, some of them Europeans. There were 3 different European powers there. The British Empire itself was composed of this messy batch of often squabbling colonies. Native Americans are all these different groups, which are, by the 18th century in particular, amalgamations of survivors of epidemics and wars and all sorts of things that create what I sometimes refer to as the real American melting pot, is in Native American communities. And it really is, I think, something does get clarified when the European imperial picture changes, when that competition on which Native American groups have based much of their political and economic and indeed, in some respects, cultural survival in the 18th century disappears, when only one empire faces what now suddenly does appear to people on both sides as Indians. I think that's part of what Pontiac's message is, that, you know, realizing that we are all Indians, right? And they are all Europeans, or at least the British are all Europeans. Maybe the French are something different. But it's part of this struggle to kind of figure out a modern, or what looks like a distressingly modern set of racial categories that separates these groups. And certainly one of the things that motivates the rage of both the Paxton Boys and Pontiac, I think, is the fact that people cross those boundaries. Those movements are directed, I think, just as much at Euro-Americans who think, on the Paxton Boys side, at Euro-Americans who think that Native Americans and European Americans can live together, and on Pontiac's side, at Native Americans who think the two sides can live together and that people can cross and there's a way of mixing. They're both trying to put forward, I think, a kind of vision of ethnic cleansing and ethnic purity that is really startlingly new and ugly, I think.
You mentioned the Paxton Boys and other groups that kind of had a developing sense of kind of rage toward Indians. But what about the Quakers? I mean, what did Native Americans in Pennsylvania think about Quakers?
If there were any good guys, I suppose they tended to see the Quakers as good guys. In particular, I think one of the things that is important is that both Quakers and Native Americans tended to develop very early on a kind of mythology of William Penn and what he stood for. You know, Onas, the great peacemaker, and all of that becomes a kind of dialogue in which each side is trying to use that image of what Quakers are supposed to be, and how they're supposed to act towards Native Americans as an important part of that relationship. But certainly, if there are people who are struggling towards some vision, or trying to maintain some vision of coexistence in the 18th century, it is the Quakers, and that's one reason I think they get slammed in Pennsylvania politics during the American Revolution. Yes.
Two quick comments and two quick questions, though the answers may not be quick. I think first comment that you do a wonderful job of drawing on the different disciplines with which history interacts to try to recover and uncover pattern, trajectory, complexity. Question there, you mention Euro-Americans a lot. You don't mention Africans or African Americans, even though you're facing south. And how does that complicate the story? The second observation is that the archaeological record is incredibly rich, not always well sifted and not well generalized from, but incredibly rich, and as reflected in detailed studies of site after site after site. How much of your story would be different if you were drawing more on the archaeological record than you are? And what might be done in a companion piece that did that?
Well, certainly I could do a lot more with material culture in general. And I think it was, part of that liberating moment of not having to say everything about early American history that led me to not write the book I set out to write was part of that. I make some choices and I did some things, and in particular, I think my choice to stress different methods in different chapters meant that certain kinds of evidence didn't get stressed at points when they could have been very useful. Certainly, understanding the place of Native Americans in the imperial world, you can't understand them apart from the empire of goods and the way in which European material artifacts in the 18th century became absolutely central to not just the economies, but in many respects the cultural identities of Native Americans in ways that only, in many respects, increased their cultural distance from Europeans at the same time they incorporated them in the European economic world. Okay, so I certainly could have done a lot more with archaeology, and that is one of the things I decided to leave out. Another thing I certainly could have done a lot more with was African Americans, but one of the striking things about that does come up over and over again, particularly I think after about the 1670s, is that once in a while Native Americans do get the glimmering that in a world that really would be run by Europeans, their situation would be much like that of African Americans. Pontiac's teacher Neolin had really a triracial view of the world, and part of the argument of these Native American prophets, as Greg Dowd has nicely pointed out, is that the Creator put people on different continents and gave them different gifts, and that's where the Creator wanted them to stay. In particular, in a particular kind of ethnocentric view of this, the Creator clearly made Native Americans first and placed them in North America, made Africans second, placed them in Africa, and only third, as an afterthought, created Europeans, and also because, I suppose because of some limitation in Europeans, they had to have a book to tell them how to live, as opposed to everyone else. Certainly, I think that has to be a big part of the story, and one of the many things that got left out.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for a wonderful
Thank
presentation.
you.
I thank you all for coming, and I believe we do still have a couple of books left for sale if anyone would like to pick one up and ask Dan to inscribe it. Good night. Thanks.
Daniel Richter is currently a history professor and director of the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Facing East from Indian Country is published by Harvard University Press. Visit hup.harvard.edu to get more information.